So just to introduce ourselves, I am Pete Collins. I am Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Students at the University of Birmingham. Sammy, who will be manning the Q&A, is Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisor for Students. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Nicole Brown. So Dr. Nicole Brown is a lecturer in education at UCL Institute of Education and Director of Social Research and Practice and Education Limited. Nicole gained her PhD in Sociology at the University of Kent for her research into the construction of academic identity under the influence of fibromyalgia. She's edited Lived Experiences of Ableism in Academia, Strategies for Inclusion in Higher Education and Ableism in Academia, Theorising Experiences of Disabilities and Chronic Illnesses in Higher Education. Co-authored Embodied Inquiry, Research Methods, and is currently authoring How to Make the Most of Your Research Journal. Nicole's research interests relate to physical and material representations and metaphors, the generation of knowledge, and more generally, research methods and approaches to explore identity and bodywork, as well as to advance learning and teaching within higher education. She tweets as at NCJ Brown, at Fibro Identity, and at Ableism Academia. And if you're not familiar with her book yet, Ableism in Academia, I thoroughly recommend you checking it out. It's an absolutely fantastic read. We sent through some discount vouchers, so you're able to access it through there. So hopefully you receive those with the sign-up link. And without further ado, welcome Dr. Nicole Brown.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this introduction. That's quite humbling. I really appreciate that. Thank you. So good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. I realized that it's late in the academic year. It's late in the evening. We are all getting tired. So I genuinely appreciate that you've made the effort of being here tonight. Just to say, just to repeat really what Pete was saying, the chat box and the Q&A functions are open. Please do use them. I don't particularly like doing lectures, so I hope that we're going to be able to have a discussion more than me talking at you. I have prepared a few slides to basically just guide my thoughts and help me sort of present things a little bit more logically. I mean, the topic was disability post-lockdown, what's changed, but I thought really I need to take a step back. In order to talk about what's changed, we need to talk first about what was it like before. So very briefly, I'm talking from experience as well as research. So I'm formally disclosing here, I have been diagnosed with Meniere's disease, with fibromyalgia, with Sjogren's syndrome. I am hard of hearing, in the meantime now profoundly deaf. That is something that's happened from birth, but over the years it just got worse and worse. So I have now got new hearing aids, which are bionic ears, and I recommend those to everyone. And that's something that's obviously shaped my experience in higher education. And that's also where my starting point was for the kind of research that I've been doing. So my doctorate was the IA in fibromyalgia, the construction of academic identity under the influence of fibromyalgia. That was something that was particularly interesting for me because fibromyalgia is a condition that's sort of on the cusp between the psychological and the somatic and the physical. And we don't really understand it very well at all. Medicine doesn't understand it very well at all. And one of the things that's typical of fibromyalgia is that the symptoms wax and wane, often within the space of a few hours, which makes it difficult to grasp for the people who've got it, but also obviously for the people that are trying to treat it, because it could be that the person is in pain first thing in the morning and then in the afternoon actually they are totally well again. So it's difficult for a medical person to kind of treat that. The other thing also with fibromyalgia is there is psychological dysfunctions and disturbances, so depression. But we don't really understand whether the depression is part of the fibromyalgia experience or whether that's something that's coming on because of all the pain that people are in. Similarly, there are sleep disturbances. I mean, again, you can imagine if you're in pain, every time you turn over, you will wake up. Now, the question is the pain triggering the sleep disturbance, or is it because you're so badly sleeping that the next day you're in pain again? So it's constantly a cycle between, you know, symptoms. And one of the biggest symptoms with fibromyalgia is brain fog, so cognitive dysfunctions, things like word retrieval problems, sequencing issues. The typical thing would be that you wash your hands before you go to toilet, or you brush your teeth and then you put the toothpaste on your toothbrush. So that kind of sequencing problems that come in. And this is really why I was interested in the construction of academic identity, where we are obviously talking about people whose work is very much about the brain, where we're expecting people to work full time on a brain that's functioning. And on the other hand, we've got issues where, you know, suddenly you washing your hands before you go to toilet. So how do people reconcile that? So that was really the starting point of my research. But through that, what then happened was, in that research, a lot of the people were talking about ableism, and they were talking about ableism in all sorts of different ways, internal as well as external ableism in academia. So at the same time, there was a book that came out in the United States, which I wanted to go to, a book launch that I wanted to go to, and I couldn't, because you could only attend that if you were in the room. So a few of us got together and decided to create a conference that would be fully accessible. And I know that in nowadays life, where everything is online, that doesn't seem to be a big thing. But, you know, 2 years ago, that was quite groundbreaking. And that's really where my work into ableism in academia came in. In the meantime, I've developed that further with a research into bodies and buildings, how staff experience buildings in academia and how they navigate the buildings depending on their conditions. And then the disclosure dances in doctoral education. So that all of those projects kind of put together built the basis for the 2 edited books, Ableism in Academia and Lived Experiences of Ableism in Academia, and also the foundation for everything I know about ableism in academia. I do not pretend that I know everything. I'm just saying that this is the foundation upon which I built my knowledge. And from that, I would like to extract the kind of the biggest challenges that people were talking about pre-lockdown. And these are the 4 things. It's about the invisibility of disabled academics, so that actually we don't see them, we don't know where they are. That is because some people don't disclose, but it's also because people drop out of academia. So there are 2 tendencies here. And that's one of the things that, because you don't have any role models, it's more difficult to find foot in academia again. So, and at the same time, because of the environment that we are in, we can't really be seen as weak or different, and therefore we don't want to disclose our conditions. So that's where the disabled academics are really not very visible. The other thing that's a big challenge is the varying needs, and often they are conflicting needs. So if we are looking, for example, now at the kind of Zoom conference calls or Teams conference calls that we're having, there are particular kinds of people who will need to see the speaker because they lip read and they rely on the lip reading, so they will need to be able to see the video. On the other hand, we've got people who are neurodiverse, and for them, having too many faces on the screen is really distracting and causes sensory overload. And that's obviously a problem, because on the one hand, we need to have all the videos on so that the lip readers can lip read. On the other hand, we need all the videos off so that the people with the sensory overload aren't getting overloaded. You know, and that's the problem with these kind of varying and conflicting needs. It's not that people want to intentionally cause issues or hurt, but obviously you're upsetting one of the 2 people. Either I'm having the video on or I have it off, but one group of people I'm bound to upset. And that's bringing me to the next point, which is the lack of awareness. Now, obviously, the kind of environment that I'm working in, I've been talking quite a lot about disabilities and ableism. You know, people become more aware now of those issues, but under normal circumstances, Often people don't realize that sitting against the sun and therefore, you know, like darkening your face could potentially cause a problem for lip readers. And that's obviously causing then hurt amongst those that are relying on those support systems. So this kind of lack of awareness causing unintentional hurt is something that a lot of people were talking about. And then the final thing is really the internalized ableism. So not only is the ableism, you know, structurally embedded and something that we experience as a society, it's actually within us itself. So one of the things, for example, in terms of disclosure, for people to be able to disclose, I have got whatever condition, they have to come to terms with that on a personal level. And that's where the internalized ableism kicks in. If you've grown up in an environment like the UK context, where we are, you know, priding ourselves for overwork and research excellence, etc., then it's quite hard to say, actually, you know what, I'm not going to be as productive as most people because whatever. You can see how that's a problem, and that's where the biggest challenges lay. I'm going to just like give you one example, which is a very typical kind of statement of what people were saying to me in all sorts of different conversations and interviews, etc. And this is: invisible disability in the academy is exhausting. Peers and work conditions constantly overlook my needs. They have difficulty grasping fluctuations, and often it's easier to shrug off my needs. As you can see, that's really talking about the invisibility of the disabled academics not being seen, about the lack of awareness, which causes unintentional hurt. So you've got exactly that here in that statement, embedded in that statement. I would now like to kind of move on very briefly to just highlight that the National Association of Disabled Staff Networks, NATSN, has produced a position paper with 12 particular recommendations. Here is the link, but these are the 12 recommendations, a brief summary. And that's basically just trying to say, actually, post-lockdown, things need to be different. So this paper came out in sort of March, April time, I think, or maybe perhaps May, where, you know, obviously we had already gone through several weeks of lockdown, and we were kind of seeing that there is a problem here in terms of how disabled people were perceived and what happened there. And NATSN put together these 12 recommendations in terms of trying to support institutions on how they can deal with disabled people and provide the relevant support for disabled people after the lockdown. So where are we now, and where are we, you know, what do I think? So this is really kind of the core of the talk: disability post-lockdown, what's changed? So this is where I am now. So what now? Basically, I have come together with two different kinds of things. Can I just sorry to interrupt myself, Vera, I have seen your question. I'm going to answer that in a second. Please bear with me. A very interesting question though, so I'm definitely want to answer that. So just to say, so what now? Where we are now is in coming from all sorts of different conferences and research projects, interviews, etc. There are 4 key elements that needed to be done in order to kind of move forward, and that's: there needs to be a strategy and policy within an institution. So there has to be this top-down approach. There is, you know, and the strategy and policy is not something that's for now, like, you know, guidance as to how do you deal with a disabled person in this particular moment. This is something more of a vision, you know, like the 5 to 10 year plan. Where do we want to be? And actually, when you bring it to the universities to say, you know what, you're excluding some really clever people just because you haven't got enough ramps in this place, actually, you've got a point. So the 5 to 10 year plan is something that they will take on. The other thing is then, obviously, we have got race equality people, envoys, ambassadors. We've got Athena Swan ambassadors, but that doesn't seem to filter through the EDI issues. So EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, should have the same position that race and gender take within a university. So therefore, we strongly recommend for the universities to build an EDI ambassador or envoy role and actually develop that, so that you've got some kind of strategy here where a person is there to hold other people to account. There is no reason or no good point in having a policy or a strategy when you don't actually have something in place where you can slap people on the wrist if they don't actually do the things that are written down in the strategy or policy. Yes, it's not a very nice way of doing it, having to slap people on the wrist, but if you've got that system in place, you won't actually need to, but the system needs to be there. The other thing is obviously the financial commitment. The universities do need to commit financially. We know that, for example, any kind of transcription services, they cost extra money, totally. But that's where the financial commitment needs to come in. And the final thing is leading by example. And that's not just institutions, but also as individuals. So what we are suggesting, or what I'm suggesting really, is that in order to get that kind of picture of where we are now and what's going to happen to all of us, is that we need to have a top-down approach as well as bottom-up. One doesn't work on its own without the other. The two need to come in together. And this is really where the individuals need to lead by example, and from the top down, you need the institutional kind of policy approach. So I can tell you, and in part, this is already answering Vera's question, I have brought this to my institution, UCL. We have now got a strategy and a policy. We have now got an EDI ambassador. And we have now got some financial commitment. Yes, the financial commitment is not quite as big as I would have hoped, but it's there. And it's, again, little by little, we are chipping away at these things. So these things do happen. Change is never easy. It's never quick, and certainly not quick enough for my taste, but it's happening. And that's the positive side of things. And this really brings me to what's happening now, what's changed, and where are we going to be disability-wise post-lockdown. So I can already see that there is a massive change regarding the well-being and mental health support across universities. Yes, again, change is not quick, and it's not happening as quickly as I would have hoped, but there is a lot more consideration around staff and student well-being and mental health. There are several programs and courses available, some even for free, to universities and individuals to develop their understanding of mental health and how they can support others with mental health issues. So we can see that that's already happening. The other thing I can see is we have started to accept some changes regarding the ways of working. Obviously, most of us are doing home office at the moment anyway. Many of us are using software and assistive technologies now because of how we work through our system. And actually, the other thing that's happened is that working has become more flexible. I do appreciate that not all the roles are the same. So there tends to be still the kind of difference between professional services contracts and academic contracts, for example, or teaching fellow contracts and research fellow contracts. So the flexibility within the working process is something that's not quite equal across all of the different kinds of contracts. But we can see that people are moving online. We can see that things are happening online now, where a year ago, 2 years ago, nobody would have thought that possible. So that's something that's already happened. And the final thing is that actually through all of this, there has been a heightened sense of community and empathy. There is something that people are pulling together a lot more now. And this is something that I can already see happening now. Now, obviously, for my taste, I'm hoping that we will have even more of that. We have more financial commitment, not just from the institutions, but from the entire sector. So research funders need to come on board as well as learn societies, for example. So I can see that trickling in, but it's not quite there yet. But having said that, I'm actually quite optimistic about the future. And I do think that there is something there that will allow disabled people and staff with neurodiversities or chronic conditions to blend in more easily and to stay in academia more easily than in the past. It's not going to be perfect, and it's going to take some time, but genuinely you can see that actually there is a certain acceptance of different kinds of knowledges that are happening around the academia now. Just to kind of complete my talk, I have got 2 more slides here that give you the outline of the 2 books that I've edited. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, but do have a look at those in your own time. Do contact me if you've got any questions or queries, and do use Twitter for that as well. And I hope that, you know, we're going to be able to discuss some of those points, but also if you've got any more questions, please do ask them. I'm more than happy to go into greater detail on one or the other things. What I would like to do is I would like to answer Vera's question now, which was, how do senior university management react when they find out that I'm researching ableism in academia? Have I ever encountered resistance, or am I concerned if it may affect my career opportunities because I'll be a troublemaker, or I'll be seen as a troublemaker? So thank you very much for those questions. Really, really important. And I totally agree with the concerns that you're raising. So it's a very conscious decision that you're taking when you announce that you have got whatever condition or disability or neurodiversity it is you have, for 2 reasons. First of all, it starts to shape the narrative around your career. People start seeing you as the person who has got whatever condition. So the first thing you need to ask yourself, are you happy with the label of being the patient? So that's one thing. It's not so much the troublemaker as being the patient. And in most cases, you will find that people are actually not particularly happy to be known as the patient. They want to be known for their scholarly contributions. So that's one of the things that's happening here. In terms of being a troublemaker, to be honest, I have not been seen as a troublemaker simply because my approach to any kind of activist work or any kind of conference work and research work I'm doing, I present the problem alongside the solution. So I was able to say, listen, these are the things that people are saying, these are the challenges people are raising, but listen, continue to listen. I have got some examples of how we can alleviate that. So that actually, that approach of saying to people, yes, I've identified the problem, but here is part of the solution, is something that basically makes people accept what you're saying and not seeing you as a troublemaker as much as somebody who's trying to fix a problem that's around. Yes, I may not have all of the answers, and obviously I can say I want the financial commitment of an institution because I'm not the one that's doing the budget. But so I totally understand that, but at the same time, it basically means that actually, you know, people listen to what I have to say. So how did the university find out when I started researching ableism in academia? To be honest, it was really interesting. When I had the conference, Ableism in Academia, I invited the provost to do the closing speech. And I explained to him, this is my work, this is what I'm trying to do, and I want you to come along and I want you to make a commitment. And he agreed to that. Again, it was because I was pointing out that there was a discrepancy between gender, race, and EDI. Because I was able to say, well, look, we've got an envoy for race, we've got an envoy for gender, but we haven't got anything for all other disabilities. He realized, actually, you know what, there is an issue. And that commitment to create that role was something that was relatively easy for him to do. At the same time, I gave him then the opportunity to actually say what he thought regarding the vision and the strategy in the long term. So in 2018, when he did the closing speech for that conference, he committed to certain things which have all happened in the meantime. Like I said, the last thing only happened like literally last month. So it took two years to get there, but I did get there in the end. So in that sense, I haven't been seen as difficult. I haven't been seen as a troublemaker, but I have been seen as the disabled person. And that's probably something that's more difficult to shed. I mean, I'm okay with it, that's fine, but that's the career position I'm in, that I can be okay with it. I do realize that somebody in a different career position with a more precarious contract, for example, will probably find it more difficult to commit to that kind of statement. That was a rather long-winded answer, and I'm sorry for that. But I do hope that I've answered it in detail. Yeah, the floor is yours. Please do shoot some other questions at me.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. That was absolutely brilliant presentation. Yeah, do please ask your questions. And I had one in the meantime. So in your book and in an interview you gave recently, you mentioned that one of the big tensions between employers and disabled staff is this kind of fixation around hyper-productivity and hyper-efficiency and things like that. I just wondered if you could talk to that a little bit about what that might look like post-lockdown, how and what advice might you give to somebody navigating that situation?
Yeah, so I think, thank you. So I think one of the things that I have seen happening is that there is, because COVID hit so many people, and so many people in such unexpected ways, there is a better understanding now about what it means to be fatigued, what it means to be tired. So even people that didn't have COVID and that weren't affected by the virus itself, because they had to move all of their teaching online, and they suddenly had to deal with things that they'd never had to deal with before, they were locked in and couldn't go out, which for disabled people is the norm, really. You know, it's those kinds of things that have been happening that people suddenly realize actually fatigue is a real issue, and tiredness is really affecting the productivity and the work that we are doing. So that understanding and that empathy, that's no longer just something where a person is trying to understand cerebrally. This is now an embodied understanding. I really know what it feels because I feel it too. And that understanding is something that's kind of building the basics and the basis for the next step, which is basically saying, you know what, certain things are more important than having 3 referable articles. And that's something that I have seen happening now. The other thing that I've seen happening is because of all of those things that have been going on around the UK, obviously flexible working is becoming, you know, more of an option, and flexible hours, but also reduced hours are becoming more of an option. So there is that element to it as well. And again, I'm actually quite hopeful that some of these things will stay. I'm realistic enough to know that people forget, and unfortunately people forget rather quickly. But at the same time, I do think that the systems that are being put in place now, for example, with the online communities, you can already see there are conferences being planned for September 2021, which they are planning as a hybrid between in-person and virtual, simply because it's now an option. It wasn't an option 2 years ago, it is now. And that's something that's going to stay. So in that sense, the productivity will also, I think that's also something that people will accept, that actually some people work perhaps a little bit slower, but that doesn't mean that their work is less valuable, it's just slower. And I think that, but that's more to do with a shift in acceptance and emotional understanding than anything, I think.
Thank you, Nicole. I have 2 questions from my end that I collect here. So the Advanced HE recently produced the statistical data of the HE sector. So in that regards about staff with disabled staff, in 2003 to 2004, there were only 2.2% of staff who declare with disability in the higher education sector. The latest data, 2018 to 2019, the numbers increased to 5.3%. There was a continual growth in terms of the charts. However, it remained to be way below what we believe would be the true representation of staff population. So given that the low number of disclosure rate, can you share some advice how university can tackle that aspect?
Yeah, so one of the things that I have written the chapter about that. So in the book, there is a chapter called Disclosure. I don't even know the exact title. It's Disclosure in Academia, a sensitive issue. And that's where I'm working from my fibromyalgia sort of study, but it is a broader, it paints a broader picture about disclosure in academia. And there are several tendencies. One of them, like you said, is on the one hand, we have got a higher number of disclosure, but at the same time, we can see that from undergraduate studies to postgraduate studies to postgraduate research through to academic staff, those numbers drop off. So whilst we have quite a high number of undergraduate students disclosing kind of disabilities or any kind of neurodiversities, the percentage from the undergraduate through to academic career is completely different. It looks awful. It looks quite horrendous, actually. And one of the things that I'm saying within the disclosure is there is, on the one hand, you've got the issue of a person needs to come to terms with the condition they've been diagnosed with. I mean, many people, if they get, for example, a cancer, if we just use cancer as an example here, if they get a cancer diagnosis, we know from what people are telling in their lived experiences, there is a whole area of grief, of rejection, of not accepting what's happening until they come to the point where they start getting used to the idea and actually start dealing with the issue. That process is exactly the same for no matter what condition you're being diagnosed with. So it's a very personal experience, first of all. So within academia, in order to get people to basically say, I have got this and this issue, what people are doing is they're basically looking at a cost-benefit analysis. So the cost is being stigmatized, being othered, being labeled as disabled. And the benefit is the support that they're getting. What kind of support am I getting? So if I'm, on the one hand, have got the personal issue already of not wanting to say, I have got cancer and I'm dealing with this, and this is real, you then have the added element, well, what does it help me if I'm saying to my employer that I have got cancer and I've got to deal with this? For undergraduate students, that cost-benefit analysis looks different. Because if they declare whatever it is they declare and disclose, they get the extra laptop, they get an extension and extenuating circumstances, they get support through software packages, they can have, any kind of mental health support as well. So there is a whole host of things that they can access, support things they can access, which they wouldn't be able to access if they don't have that diagnosis. For academic staff, it looks different. The grant funders don't change their deadlines. Promotions criteria are what they are. So there isn't that much, point really in saying, well, actually, I have got X, Y, Z. On the other hand, the benefit of disclosing, such as like software that you may be, assistive technology, etc., is not always available for staff. It's available for students, but not for staff. So again, what then is the point? So the only way that an institution can get people to disclose their conditions is, first of all, to develop a system of support for staff. And basically, I mean, one of the things that I've experienced in my research was there was one particular university, which I'm not naming, where staff were given the opportunity to enroll as students for their professional development. Once they were enrolled as students, they could access student support services. So what you got is disabled staff enrolling on courses, basically just to access the student fundings. Now, to me, that's massively problematic because obviously the student pot should still be there for the students. But on the other hand, it's also massively problematic to say the students can have, I don't know, Dragon Naturally, the supportive, software, especially for those that are dyslexic, and the dyslexic staff cannot have Dragon Naturally. So that's really what the universities, where the universities can do the most, is to have a support system in place with that it equals the support system that students get. And once you've got that in place, then people will be more confident in actually saying, you know what, I need that support too.
Thank you, Nicole. There's also another question linking to in the learning and teaching environments. Whilst conventional discussion around that is about how we support disabled students in learning and teaching, but less about how we support disabled staff during the learning and teaching. In particular, one example would be when students doing the PowerPoint presentation, the PowerPoint slide may be not dyslexic friendly, or the color contrast, a range of different things. How would you recommend university can support students to raise awareness so that it make it a more inclusive learning and teaching environment for both sides of the equation?
So generally, I mean, I'm a great fan of the universal design for learning, which basically means that we are building an environment. We don't need to know the special needs of our students. We just automatically build an environment that means that people can access it. So for example, in terms of the PowerPoint slides, a lot of people still use black writing on white background. That's quite difficult for certain people, dyslexic people, Erlen syndrome, any kind of, you know, like processing disorders as well. But if you put the background sort of off-white, for example, the people that aren't affected by, you know, the black on white, they won't probably even notice that you haven't used a white background. Honestly, it just goes past most people. But those people that benefit from it can benefit from it automatically. But one thing, and that goes back to one of the things that I said in my presentation initially, we must not think that we can fulfill everybody's needs all of the time. That's just not possible. Like the example I gave with having the video on and off at the same time, it's not working. You can meet people's needs for 90% of the time for 90% of the people. That's realistic target. But to kind of try and think that you can fit everybody's sort of needs all of the time, that's quite unrealistic. And I think this is the kind of, so when I'm doing training sessions or speeches or something like that at my own institution, I always say to people, don't try to fit 100% of the support for 100% of the people for 100% of the time, because it's not realistic. And that is more powerful than anything else you do, because you give people permission to make a judgment call on whether they can do X, Y, Z, or whether they can leave it out or have to leave it out. And that permission basically means that people are more likely to actually buy into the idea of a universal design for learning. They're trying to do the best they can, recognizing they can't do it all, but we're still trying to do the best. And that's the only thing that you can do. So on the one hand, I think I do not believe in trying to get people to do everything perfectly, because that's unrealistic. And I think that kind of permission is something that the universities do need to give, not to expect. And that's going back again to Pete's question about productivity. And I think that's something that, you know, because of the difficult times we've had, people realize actually there is a limit to what I can do. I'll try my best, and students recognize that. If you go to students and say, look, I'm trying my best, I'm doing all I can, help me do it better, but, you know, accept mistakes because I'm learning alongside with you, they are actually really accepting of that. The difficulty is almost like it's about managing expectations. The difficulty is when you kind of go in there with unrealistic expectations, or when you go into a situation where you're basically wanting everything. That's when things usually go wrong. So I think realistic targets, realistic strategies, realistic visions, and you know, a genuine concern for the people involved is probably what gets you the furthest within higher education.
Great, thank you, Nicole. There's a quick question about, you know, we've made quite a lot of advances in terms of accessibility in the last few months, and we were wondering about going forward, going into next year, a few months down the line, perhaps, you know, there's quite scary economic predictions, and in that context, I'm just wondering, do you feel that the appetite within higher education institutions to continue expanding the accessibility and build on the gains that we've made during COVID-19 will still be there, or do you think there will be a tendency to withdraw?
No, I think, and you know, I again, I'm optimistic actually, and I do think that they will be there, because I mean, I just see it on my own course. The course I'm teaching at the moment is an undergraduate course, and we have probably got about half the students from UK context, and the other half are international students. And the fact that we're able to actually access all of those students across the world in whichever lockdown situation they find themselves in is something that the programs recognize. It's something that managers recognize. We have now learned to deal with something that wasn't thinkable 2 years ago. And actually, business-wise, it makes sense. So I can't see why a university would go back on that. Obviously, and I totally agree with that, the online learning doesn't replace the in-person teaching, the in-person learning. It's not the same experience, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a worse experience. It's going to be a different one, but not necessarily a worse one. And that's something that I think the universities will be quite keen to check in on, really, and to basically gain the financial benefit from. So in that sense, I think the accessibility, because actually it makes business sense, I don't think the accessibility will be totally lost. I do think, though, that certain things people will forget. So whilst at the moment everybody knows what it feels like to be fatigued, in a year's time, somebody with chronic fatigue syndrome saying, I'm tired, I'm fatigued, people will have forgotten what that kind of tiredness and fatigue feels like. So I do think that there is something that will get lost, but because it makes business sense, I don't think that aspect of it will disappear completely. The other thing is also, actually, a lot of the learned societies and research funders start recognizing what disabled people can actually bring to the table. So I know that the Wellcome have changed several eligibility criteria. They've also changed some of the funding criteria. So things where in the past they've said, you know, you can't use your money for this or that. They've changed all of those things as well. I also know that the Royal Society is due to publish a report, I think in 2 weeks' time now, which was specifically about the experience of disabled scientists in the UK. And again, there is a lot of traction in higher education and academia and the associated fields, where people can realize, actually, you know, there are people that bring something really important to the table, and we can't and shouldn't exclude them, because if we did exclude them, then we would, you know, do ourselves harm. So that's why I do think that that element of learning from COVID will stay with us. Perhaps I'm a little bit overly enthusiastic and optimistic, but I generally am, actually. I do think that I think that in that sense, the pandemic has brought some advantages to our lives in the long term.
It's been absolutely extraordinary to see. You know, there's been so much conversation around, you know, there was a lot of resistance from higher education to implement some of the adjustments, and then COVID came along and suddenly it was
yes,
available.
absolutely.
So just in terms of that element where, you know, there's a few things people might forget about, is there anything that we can do as disabled people to try and ensure that people don't forget?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is to continue talking about it and to continue bring it to people's minds and to kind of continue the conversations. And I know that it's difficult for individuals to, you know, to publicly disclose their conditions, but I think that's the one thing that's been the most powerful, is actually hearing from people who are dealing with difficult conditions and disabilities, and to listen to them as to what they've got to say. I've just seen that question here also, Kathleen. Considering with what I've said about the benefits of online and hybrid access to events such as conferences, are we at risk that we will overlook physical access because people could instead access it virtually? I think that's an interesting question. I mean, personally, I don't think there will be that, because people are missing the networking opportunities. And you can say what you want, but networking online is not the same as networking in person. So I do think that people will try to kind of create that physical environment and that physical conference. And therefore, there will be that push towards making it, the rooms physically accessible as well. Because as soon as you've got somebody, with a wheelchair, you can't necessarily, and no ramp, for example, you would actually exclude that person from networking. And how can an institution or an organization justify that they are excluding somebody from the networking opportunity? There is no justification for that. So whilst that progress may be slower, I agree with that. It may well be, well, you can join us online. So that progress may be slower. I don't think it's something that you can stop. The other thing that we mustn't forget is higher education obviously is not something that's isolated from the rest of society. And we can see in the wider society, I mean, for example, the sunflower lanyards, that's something that gains traction in wider society, and it becomes, I mean, Tesco have even got their own branded sunflower lanyards. So it's something that's obviously, is an issue in wider society too. So that's why I don't think that they can totally ignore that development. Annie, I wonder if a shift to pride in difference would be useful. Damien Milton is an autistic academic who describes himself as a constructive irritant. I totally agree with that, but it takes it's not just the pride in difference that's required here. It's also an acceptance that people may see you as the autistic person rather than as the scholar who has produced something really important on mobility and migration studies. And to be honest, whilst I'm happy to be, for people to know that I have got my issues, I don't want to be necessarily be known as the person with fibromyalgia or the person with Meniere's or whatever. I actually want to be known for the contributions I'm making. So there is this, it's really difficult. I'm in a comfortable place now to say, yes, I'm profoundly deaf. I haven't got a problem with it. I've always been hard of hearing throughout my life, but at the same time, I don't want to be the deaf person. I want to be the person who's produced some work on research journals. You see what I mean? So that shift is a very personal decision. And if somebody can make that at a personal level, that's great. But I wouldn't expect everyone to come along those lines.
So Nico, in terms of moving forward, you mentioned about for agenda, for example, gender equality and race equality. There have been more visible champion, partly maybe through Athena Swan and Race Equal Charter. In terms of disability topic in the higher education sector, would you envision it would be more helpful to have a sector-specific equality charter mark, or something more generic that can also cover to other sectors?
I think, well, the problem with these markers is that they do become a tick box exercise. I mean, Athena Swan and race equality charters, they are well intentioned. They are well intended, but at the same time, there are a lot of universities where these people have been able to gain a really good grading for their charter mark. But when you ask the people working in those industries or businesses or organizations or higher education institutions, they're like, actually, my experience is not what's happening on that charter mark, right? So that's problematic. So whilst they are there for a good reason and they've got something to add, there is an issue with those things becoming a sort of a tick box exercise, and that's problematic. So I generally believe it doesn't need a charter mark, but it does need from the institutional commitment, saying actually institutionally, even without the charter mark, institutionally we commit not just to gender equality or race equality, but also disability equality, and that can do, you know, institutions can do that all by themselves. They don't need a charter mark for that.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things I've always thought is, you know, unless, you know, you're including, you know, disabled women, disabled LGBT people, disabled people from minorities, then you're not actually servicing that community.
Yes.
You know?
And that's something that's also often, that's the problem also with any kind of EDI issue, is that sometimes then it's like, well, is the gender issue more important than the race issue? And actually it shouldn't be, that there shouldn't be a hierarchy. And within disability, sometimes you get this kind of hierarchy, you know, of how badly ill am I? It's like, well, hang on a minute, it's not about that. It's about recognizing that people work in different ways and trying to find ways of how we can make sure that everybody can work in their preferred way, and that's the end of it. Kathleen says, thank you for my answer, and is also commenting on the importance of networking and sense of belonging. So I totally agree with you. There is this thing that, you know, actually things will continue in person. So yeah, thank you.
Let's hope so. It's about having a nice balance and finding ways that work for as many people as possible. Yes. So with that in mind, we're coming to an end. We're running out of time, and I just wondered, before we go, Nicole, did you have any closing remarks or anything you wanted to mention?
Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been here and has been listening. This is really, really great, and I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity here. Thank you, Pete, for inviting me to this as well. I think, you know, at the end of the day, you know, there is much that needs to be done still, and if every one of us chips away a little bit in the kind of sphere of influence we are working within, I think that's what helps in the long term. One person on their own can make a difference. We've seen that with Greta Thunberg. But it needs that one person to gain traction with other people. The one person on their own can't do it. So everybody chipping away a little bit will actually create that bigger wave, and that's required in higher education.
Absolutely wonderful. Nicole, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. So much appreciated.
Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful talk. And don't forget, everybody, check out Ableism in Academia, Nicole's book. It is available now from UCL Press, and thank you all for coming and for joining us.
And the download is free, so just download.
Download is free.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
And you. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.